Right, we are recording, and good afternoon, everybody from Colombo, and good morning and good evening to everyone else joining us from all over the world. Thank you for joining in. Um, Welcome back to those who are joining us for our last session. This is day 2 of our global forum on forum on climate change. So today's session is on incorporating climate and disaster risk management into actions, and we have a fantastic panel. We have Ms. Donna Lagdemio. She's the Senior Global Policy Advisor and Asia Pacific Focal Point for Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Mr. Dionis Mamba, the Director of Research and Education, SLYCAN Trust. Dr. Linda Ann Stevenson, Head of Knowledge Management and Scientific Affairs and the Deputy Head of Development and Institutional Affairs at the Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research, as well as Ms. Kerbal Blair, who's the Loss and Damage Youth Network. My name is Sanasha Ekanaika. I'm the Program and Communications Manager at SLYCAN Trust, and also welcome to everybody who's joining us from Facebook. So just to let everyone know, this session will first have the panelists speaking. So each of them will make their presentations, and followed by that, we'll have a short round of Q&As. And then we will have our group work. So for those who joined in yesterday, you all will be assigned to the same groups. And for those who haven't joined in, I'm just going to display a slide in a minute. If you could kindly rename yourselves on Zoom to the thematic area in which you want to join, I think that would probably be good. 1 second. Right, I hope you could see my screen. It should be a PowerPoint presentation. So these are the 3 groups that we'll be working in. We couldn't have the biodiversity group, unfortunately. So we have 3 groups. We have oceans and coastal ecosystems, climate change and disasters, and sustainable food systems. So kindly rename yourself on Zoom, your name, followed by the thematic group that you want to join. So for example, I'm Sanasha, and if I will join the group, I will join the group on climate change and disasters. So kindly rename yourselves, and members from our team will have it on a list, and following the Q&As, we will put you into separate breakout rooms where you will discuss the project in detail. We also have another session for group work tomorrow, and following this session. Alrighty, so that's it from me. And now we will move on to our first presentation by Ms. Donna Lagdemio. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. I am Donna Lagdemio from the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, the global reference center of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So my task this afternoon, evening my time, is to share with you some ideas on how concretely we'll be able to translate climate and disaster risk management policies into actions. Because I am from the Red Cross, I would like to frame my messages and give you 4 key things that can be easily remembered by using IFRC. So let's start with I. In translating policies into actions, one key thing that we have realized over the past 2 decades in engaging with communities and policymakers in bridging science, policy, and practice is to ensure that these policies are actually anchored on solid risk narratives. Ensuring that it uses an integrated risk management approach, which means it brings together the different phases of disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and also the ecosystem management restoration approaches, allows us to see things in a perspective wherein we can manage risk at different timescales. So policies don't automatically translate into action. And also action don't necessarily automatically translate into policy narratives to ensure that they are actually responsive to the needs on the ground. So to be able to ensure this, one key element is to anchor it on integrated risk management approaches. This is something that we have been testing over the past 10 years in 10 countries globally under a global coalition called Partners for Resilience, where we brought in the ERR community and the climate change community and also the environment community together and framed a resilience into such an approach. Second key component in translating policies into action is by embedding science. Using forecasts, using science, and using data is important for us to ensure that our policies are responsive to the risks of today and risks of tomorrow. I think gone are the days when we develop policies that only address the problems that we are facing now. And this is essential if you want our disaster and climate risk management policies to be responsive and to be ahead of its time and to be able to identify the risks people will be facing at different parts of the country, at different parts of the world. And I think this is something that um, we are really strongly seeing, especially in the disaster risk management community, because in the climate policy, of course, science is naturally embedded, but in the disaster risk management policy, the use of science did not progress until probably, it started probably around 10 years, 5 years ago. But this is slowly becoming the norm in terms of policy development, both at national and subnational level. The third element that I would like to share with the group is ensuring that our disaster and climate policies are actually crafted and developed with the same objective in mind, where we all foresee that we will aim towards resilience building. It's not about just developing a policy or crafting a policy just for the sake of having a disaster risk or climate risk policy, but it is about really ensuring how this policy can be translated into a national plan or a framework, which then translates into a roadmap towards resilience building. And in doing all of these things, it is important that we think of resilience not just as a methodology or not just an endpoint, but to see it as both. Because we need both the mindset that we are building and strengthening anticipatory, adaptive, transformative, and responsive capacities, but at the same time, we are also envisioning a state of resilience, permanent resilience at some point. The last component in a formula that we have seen as effective on the ground is, of course, anchoring all of these policies and all of our actions on the needs of communities and bringing communities and different stakeholders together. At the end of the day, this risk, whether that's climate or disaster risk policies, will not be if they are not responsive to the needs on the ground, then it won't be really as effective as what the big words show. So in moving forwards, I think this IFRC formula has been effective in both at the subnational and national levels. And it's something that can guide both the practitioners, the young people, the policymakers in ensuring that our big plans and our big dreams on disaster risk management and climate risk management are all responsive and are all evolving and are all centered on the needs of communities on the ground, while grounded as well in science and the evolving risk patterns. I think I also want to emphasize that in connecting the policy with the action, it doesn't happen automatically. One thing does not, one big word does not automatically lead to ensuring that action is done on the ground. And finding these elements, these entry points is always key to understanding how best the linking of policies and plans can be done at subnational and at national levels. It is an area which is fascinating to be part of, because you've seen just over the past decade how different people and policymakers been really the opening of mindsets and being and allowing us to really challenge norms has been greatly seen at different levels, which gives us a lot of hope in really ensuring that at the end of the day, we will be able to connect these two silos together and not just anchor ourselves with big words, but really, really find ways to unpack and operationalize them at the ground level. It is this approach has been effective both at national and subnational levels, and it is also something that has given us a lot of good practices, a lot of concrete experiences that we are current and we have been continuing over the past in all countries globally in our hope to really address the humanitarian consequences of climate change. The linking of science, policy, and practice is crucial, especially even in humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross. And I believe this is something that we all share. Whether we come from whatever sector, this type of approach, this type of framing and mindset is something that will help us truly build resilience and truly build up and scale up climate action. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna, for that presentation. I would like to move on to Dennis.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. Let me just share this presentation. Okay, so Donna has given us, I think, a very good overview of like why it's important to deal with climate risk, why risk management is important, and all these different levels that it applies to, from policies to implementation. And I want to go into a bit more detail on what is climate risk and how can we manage it when we actually develop projects, especially youth-led projects, but also in general. So first up, what is risk? What do we talk about when we talk about risk? That is the definition from the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. Risk is the potential for consequences, where something of value is at stake and where the outcome is uncertain. And it results from the interaction of vulnerability, exposure, and hazard. So I think it's important to keep in mind and to note that risk is not like we cannot just say the risk is 7 or 10 or 11. There's a bit more that goes into it, and there are certain elements that come together and that we need to look at in detail to understand what the risk actually is, and also how we can manage and reduce it. So this is a graphic that shows this basically. So one component of the risk would be the hazard. That can be composed of climate signal and direct physical impacts. For example, that could be something like a flood or a drought. It can be a temperature increase. It can be water scarcity. Things like that would fall under the hazard. Then we have exposure and we have vulnerability. And vulnerability is composed of sensitivity and capacity. And we can already see there are multiple things that can change and that will reduce the overall risk. So for example, if exposure reduces, risk will reduce. If we increase coping or adaptive capacities, that will also reduce the risk. If we increase sensitivity, that will decrease vulnerability and therefore decrease the risk. So there are a lot of things that we can influence and also some things that we cannot influence. For example, the climate signal. We cannot influence when we plan projects. It can, of course, be influenced through mitigation efforts, but that's a different topic. So that is risk. How can we manage risk? These are the different stages of risk management. Actually, there's one stage that comes even before that, that would be risk awareness. So first, we need to be aware of the fact that there is a risk to whatever we are doing, to whatever project we are planning, whatever activity we want to implement. And if we know there are risks there, we can conduct a risk assessment. And then we can employ different measures to reduce, prevent, and transfer risk. So the first step would be to prevent risk. For example, that could be by reducing exposure. shifting the project location, for example, or doing the project in a way that it doesn't inflict a certain kind of risk. Risk reduction, that would be most of the things I talked about earlier. For example, reducing vulnerability would be something that we can do to reduce risk. And we can have certain safety measures, we can have certain capacities that we can build, and certain procedures we can employ to reduce risk of project implementation. And then risk transfer, that would, for example, be in insurance. We can insure certain parts of activities. Of course, that might not be possible for smaller projects, but this is something to keep in mind. It's a potential part of risk management. And then even after that is done, there will be a residual risk, and that risk we'll have to keep in mind that we retain it. So there will always be some risk that we cannot mitigate. And that risk we need to plan for as a contingency. So if we talk about projects, there are two ways in which risk in general and climate risk in specific can be addressed. One would be actual project risk management. So basically risk proofing the project as much as possible. And the other would be addressing climate risk through the project. And I think Linda, when she's presenting, will give like a number of examples of projects that address climate risk and maybe have also risk management integrated into them. So in general, I just want to say project risk management would be basically to assess the risk for a project, for activities of the project, and address them in a way that allows the project to achieve its goals, even though the risk is there. And again, we have to keep in mind that risk is a potential for something. So there are always probabilities involved. We cannot be certain that something will happen, but we might have a probability, and we might have an idea of the intensity of the risk. Like, is it a small risk? Is it a very big risk? Is it likely to happen? Is it unlikely to happen? And also what the timeframes for this are. I will come to this in the next slide also. So basic steps would be to conduct a risk assessment, then go through all the project planning, the project activities and objectives, and incorporate the results of the assessment into that, and refine the objectives in a way that it makes sense. And then to incorporate risk management strategies and knowledge into the implementation of the project activities, and also into monitoring and evaluation of the project. And to have periodic assessments of the new state of risk and adjust the project accordingly, depending on how long the project is going. If it's only a 6-month project, that might not be necessary, but if it goes over multiple years, we definitely need to have periodic assessments and adjust the project accordingly. And on the other hand, projects, I'm sorry for the traffic noises in the background, projects can address climate risk. A lot of the projects we are planning on, for example, the ones that have been submitted and the ones the group work will focus on, address climate risk in one way or another. And climate risk can be to physical infrastructure, it can be to equipment and assets, but it can also be like more intangible and indirect. It can be a risk to social cultural frameworks, to social cohesion, to different practices. It can impact the way we do things, procedures and practices. It can impact the resources that are available, the finances we have, and it interacts with policies and plans that are there in place. It will require us to engage with other stakeholders and actors, and it will also link to regional and global processes, for example, the SDGs or the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So if we are planning a project and in the group work, that will be something the youth participants will be doing, I think these are considerations to keep in mind. So one would be basically the assessment part. What information do we have about the risk that is there? What part of the project is exposed to risk? How vulnerable are certain activities and certain project components? What are the capacities that are there to cope with that at the moment? And how probable and how severe are the risks? And coming to that, connecting to that timeframes, how long is the project going to go? What is the planning for the project? And then also what are the short and long-term timelines? For example, there might be risks that are outside the project duration per se. So for example, if you build some, like a bridge or some kind of infrastructure, if you build a school, If we build something like that, it will be there after the project is finished, but there will still be climate risks that are there. So we need to take into account what is the sustainability of the project and its the things it produces. And then affordability and feasibility. What is our capacity actually to adjust the project to risks? Like, do we have finances to have like alternative plans in place? Can we deal with potential losses and impacts? How flexible are the activities that we are planning? And how flexible is the timeline also? For example, if we're doing an agricultural project and it's about cultivation, what happens, for example, if there's no rain? Or if we're planning a project to distribute like drought-tolerant crops, what is the potential that there might be a flooding? And how can we deal with that? Opportunities, that's, I think, the flip side to this. There are risks, but also they might open up windows of opportunity for us. And there might be co-benefits that come if we actually risk-proof the project. So if we employ like a climate resilience aspect to the project, this might allow us to gain some additional benefit out of it, or some synergy, for example, with some other project that is happening, some other activities that people are doing. On the other hand, there might also be trade-offs. If we risk-proof the project, there might be things we are losing, for example, money or time. And then risk layering, planning for different types of risks and also seeing how they interact. For example, COVID-19 is a good example of like a non-climate risk that still might exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and that might have a big influence on projects. So for example, for the projects we are doing at the moment, there are a lot of workshops that are not possible to do, that we plan to do in person, but now we had to shift them to a virtual method. And this is something that needs to be kept in mind. Of course, we cannot predict a pandemic to happen, but there's always a possibility that something happens that is not related to climate change. For example, some things also are predictable. There might be elections, and then there might be a phase where it's not possible to get much interaction with government after the elections, when like positions shift and people move around. So we need to plan for that and maybe have critical phases that require government approvals, not to be within that time frame, but to have them earlier or after that. Or to have if we know there might be possibilities, for example, for large-scale flooding, to have the option to shift events to virtual mode. And then last point is risk ownership. Who actually owns that risk? Who is going to be liable for the things that happen? Is it something that the government is liable for? Is it something we as the project implementers will have to shoulder? Or is it going to be like the people we work with, for example, farming communities that are going to face the risk? If we build some infrastructure and it gets destroyed, will it be us that lose money, or will it be the farmers that face these consequences? Or will it be the natural environment? So all these things need to be kept in mind, and I would encourage everyone in the group work to address all of these. This is just an example of a risk management tool that's from USAID. There are a number of tools out there. This, for example, is a relatively comprehensive one. You could look it up. There's also, for example, this risk management tool from the Asian Development Bank. There are a number out there. Depending on the scale of your project and the capacity you have, try to have some kind of risk management there, some kind of contingency plans, and keep all these things in mind. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dennis, for that. And I think Dennis's presentation will actually set the context for our next presentation by Dr. Minda and Stevenson. But before we go into that presentation, I just want to quickly remind everybody once again on the group work. So I'm just going to share my screen again very quickly. So if you cannot rename yourselves, you can also maybe write on the chat on which group you would want to join. This is specifically for those who didn't join us for the group work yesterday. Those who did, we have your names already. But for the ones joining us today, I've written it on the chat as well. Just maybe write on the chat, just say which group you want to join. We have climate change and disaster risk. We have oceans and coastal ecosystems, as well as sustainable food systems. So just type in the chat on which group you want to join and be a part of, and we'll be happy to assign you there. Thank you very much, and over to you, Linda. Linda.
Yep, just coming in. Let me try and share my screen. Okay. Can you see?
Yes, looks good.
Excellent. Let me start the slideshow. It's a little bit slow on the side. Okay, how's that?
Looks good.
Everything good? Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Linda Stevenson, and I'm representing APN as the head of knowledge management and scientific affairs. APN stands for the Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research. First, thanks Wasita and SLYCAN and everyone behind the scenes for organizing this Global Youth Summit on climate change. Really exciting, and it's an honor to speak on behalf of APN today. I'll talk a little bit about APN and then provide a few case studies that I hope will complement the previous speakers. And these will be on disaster risk, preparedness and management. And I'll also emphasize the importance of continued informal dialogue on climate change among all stakeholders. And I'll provide a specific example of a recent science policy dialogue that we held in South Asia, for South Asia in Bhutan. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about who we are. I always like to say APN. We were established in 1996 as an intergovernmental research network with 22 member countries. Our focus areas are very broad under an overarching umbrella of global change and sustainability, and range from really climate change and climate variability, biodiversity and ecosystem services, to risk reduction and resilience and the societal aspects or the human dimensions of global change. We have 4 strategic goals that support regional research collaboration, building capacity to participate in scientific research, particularly for early career scientists, and encourage science policy interactions, and of course, as a network, cooperate with other global like-minded organizations. Some of the results of a review of our 4th strategic phase stresses that we continue to provide, real benefit to our member countries in the region, focusing on research in the global change sustainability space and strengthening the capacity of early career scientists in the region. In the past 5 years, we completed over 119 projects, and I'm really happy to say that 70% of these engaged early career professionals, which is a really monumental effort here in achieving our goal to capacitate younger scientists. Our activities engaged over 1,600 scientists, 11,600 people, and our outputs, 650 outputs, many were peer-reviewed articles, policy briefs, handbooks, and toolkits. And I think the handbooks and toolkits are really important in this dialogue that we're having today. The phrase cloud on the left of the screen shows some of the key priorities of our member countries and climate change and its impacts, and particularly extreme weather events, climate scaling, disaster risk reduction, and technology transfer. Next up is our recent special issue. I'm so proud to say that this has finally been published. It was published in October 2020, and it was a joint endeavor with the Asian Institute of Technology in AIT in Thailand. In this activity, we brought together APN project leaders in an international symposium and write shop, which added real value, to the need for face-to-face, peer-peer collaboration at the regional level. So when I say regional level, I mean country, as opposed to, regional levels inside, at the national level. This is particularly important for writing manuscripts for publication and having that peer-peer reviewing process to review the manuscripts. In this particular slide, you'll see an APN knowledge synthesis, which also form part of this particular work. And if you're really interested in our outputs between 2013 to 2018 on climate change, then I really encourage you to have a look at that. We have conducted so many climate-related disaster risk and management projects, really since our climate adaptation framework was initiated in 2013. And this particular, I mean, we can't cover everything. So this presentation will give a flavor of what we do, and we'll focus on 4 case studies at national and regional levels in South and Southeast Asia. I really want to follow on with an example of how the informal climate dialogue is so important in climate risk, in discussing climate risk and follow-up action, particularly the communication factor between science, policy, practitioners, and communities. This case study, this capacity building activity in the Philippines, focused on enhancing climate risk resilience through human security development and capacity building in the local province of Aurora. And it's really cool because this engaged scientists and experts from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, working together with government officials in the local government units. And we see more and more of this, but 5 years ago, this was practically unheard of. So the focus of this project was to build institutional resilience of the local governments so that they could formulate their local climate change and disaster risk action plans. And some of the key results actually showed that the process of preparing local climate change action plans really is a major challenge. Institutional capacity assessments have revealed that there's a strong correlation between the expertise and the position within the LGU. And one of the keys to building the institutional capacity is the competency development inside local government units, because they really are the frontline agencies in climate adaptation and disaster risk management. My cat's screaming in the background. I don't know if you can hear her. I do apologize. Next up, experience with natural disasters in Southeast Asia have, excuse me, have intensified efforts to enhance cooperation mechanisms among official disaster management institutions and community participation. So this also revealed the need to enhance rapid mapping technical assistance to be developed and shared among early career scientists. And this was done through a summer school on improving community capacity in rapid disaster mapping. And so the aim of the summer school was to train early career scientists to improve their knowledge in the implementation of the rapid mapping techniques for providing fast and accurate geospatial information for the decision-making processes needed for sustainable management and for disaster risk reduction. And, essentially, the activity itself supported the idea of rapid mapping to communities, and that portraying a spatial representation of a disaster-prone area may improve the awareness of community perception on the environmental risk. And in this case, the risk factor was looking at landslides. Next slide. Okay, this particular activity looked at identifying factors that lead to successful long-term approaches of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, and the strategies for integration into regional planning. The key goals of post-disaster response and longer-term recovery efforts in these four disaster zones that you see here have been shown to build back better, place more emphasis on environmental sustainability, and to strengthen resilience of communities at risk to be able to cope with and adapt to a range of future environmental changes and risks. The case study findings show that efforts to improve the performance of these systems so that they support long-term recovery need to closely consider the causes of vulnerability, intended beneficiaries, the framing of solutions, and issues of governance, including legitimacy, responsiveness, accountability of the authorities. And Dr. Salim al-Haq of ICAD, I'm sure you all know him, based in Bangladesh, was engaged in this study, and he noted that the outputs add significantly to our understanding from examining past events that have caused loss and damage from climatic events, tracing the outcomes beyond the immediate recovery period. Another study in South Asia, really kind of different aspect, but very important, looked at opportunities and challenges of compliance to safe building codes in two South Asian countries, Bangladesh and Nepal. Recent disasters in these countries highlight that non-compliance to building codes is one of the significant causes of building-related disasters. Increased institutional and community awareness of the importance of safe building codes presents an opportunity to explore barriers and enablers to compliance. The results really indicate that there's a crucial need for integration of building regulations and building codes, and that there's a mounting emphasis to act, particularly after recent disasters. There's also a real need for greater intervention, as really surprisingly, there's little knowledge of building codes even among built environment professionals. I mean, that shocked me, and not a lot shocks me. Finally, on this particular slide, there's a really severe lack of capacity and a crucial need for capacity building at all stakeholder levels in this aspect, from formally trained built environment professionals to informal sector construction workers. Let's see, moving on. So this is my most exciting slide, I think. This slide highlights the real importance of informal dialogue and communication. And APN, we regularly organize these kinds of sub-regional level events. These dialogues they're crucial and allow for informal discussions on common issues of importance that are outside formal conventions. Inside formal conventions, you don't often get to speak your own personal mind. So it's a really nice opportunity to be relaxed, informal, and discuss real issues at the same time. This particular informal stakeholder dialogue was held in Bhutan and brought together government officials, scientists, members of local communities, and the media from countries in South Asia, and they all discussed disaster risk reduction and resilience. To ensure the informal yet very serious nature of the dialogue, games were played. As you can see on the top of the screen, a snapshot of all of these participants. They played a game called Dissolving Disasters, and I got to thank the Red Cross and Red Crescent because this is where the idea came from, and it's lovely to see this kind of collaboration. So this game was a physical participatory activity aimed to support experiential learning and dialogue on the concept of resilience. I mean, all of these participants that you see, policymakers, scientists, they were farmers in this game. And they had to make individual and collective decisions, each with different consequences. So the discussions afterwards that emerged, about the real importance of this kind of decision making, particularly when there's so much uncertainty. And as I said, I'd really like to thank the Red Cross, Red Crescent for we use the games a lot in our dialogues, and they're real icebreakers for these kinds of informal events. I want to talk a little bit about communication processes, and these are a key point of the discussion, and 4 main points emerged about their importance. I'm sorry, I've gone over my time, and what needs to be done. These are communicating to enable informed decisions, writing for people to understand and to act, capture knowledge from practice, and stress the importance of innovation. This dialogue stressed the importance of strengthening regional collaboration in South Asia and strengthening collaboration in data collection, data sharing, and data use for effective response to disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. One last message before I end on this dialogue. We always hear almost everywhere these days that translating actionable science into practice needs much more work, and really a new generation of communicators who may be able to act as intermediaries is needed. There was consensus that this is of course not going to be an easy thing to do. So providing key science messages to policymakers is simply at the moment not that effective. Implementers really need to be informed, advised, and engaged from the beginning in order for effective decisions to be taken and to be implemented. So in this context too, all of our participants agreed that while there are enough policies in place already, what really is lacking is the implementation of these policies for disaster risk reduction. And I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much. Thanks for the opportunity. And I'm so sorry I've gone over my time again. I did that last week too. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No worries, Linda. I think that was useful, especially I think for those who are developing project proposals. I think it's important to know these case studies and actual use cases of how this can be implemented. And also just to quickly remind everybody, Dr. Linda mentioned about Mr. Salim ul Haq. We do have a keynote address by him later today for those who would like to join. It is at 4:30 p.m. Central European Time or 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So please do join that. I'm sure that would also provide a lot of insight into the work that you're doing. So moving on to our next presentation by Mr. Velvet. Hi. Could you say something about it? I don't think I heard you earlier.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Thank you to the Sri Lankan government and SLYCAN Trust for convening this forum. I noticed on your website that your climate change theme covers cost and financing, which is the issue that is important in loss and damage because it's an undue burden placed on vulnerable communities. So for my presentation, I will focus on sorry, I'm having trouble changing my slides. There we go. Yeah, I will focus on loss and damage in the context of the climate change framework. I will address what's being done, but focus on the gaps that have inspired the loss and damage youth coalition to action. So firstly, understanding loss and damage. So it is the final cost of climate change after mitigation, which is that initial cost of investing in reducing emissions through initiatives such as sustainable agriculture or renewable energy. The second cost falls with adaptation, where more cost is implicated in dealing with the consequences of unavoidable climate change. So for example, this is a road that I have traversed frequently, and this road has frequently been flooded because this is a mangrove that was unfortunately sacrificed to build this road, which underscores the land constraints that small islands like mine face. So to address this, some coastal engineering was implemented to reinforce the seawall. The road is being lifted. It's currently under construction. My next image shows Kiribati, which again illustrates the constraints of small island states where they have coastal dwelling that is undoubtedly under threat. So I say this to emphasize that the paradox of economic metaphors that was highlighted in a recent podcast called the Climatic Podcast focused on the dilemma of addressing the value of natural assets versus a failure to value, or focusing on margins. And this was addressed in an opening session during this forum. So next, I will focus more on defining loss and damage specifically. Damage covers that economic costs in income and physical assets due to destruction to infrastructure or property, which tends to be repairable, replaceable. However, an argument can be made for the psychosocial effects of losing a home or living in a disaster zone that is classified under the non-economic consequences borne by individuals, society, and the environment. So those losses that are irreplaceable are classified under health. For example, we have observed that nutrition in food is being implicated by climate change. We understand that heat waves disproportionately affect the elderly. Unfortunately, there is alarming suicide among farmers in countries like India, where their livelihoods are under threat. Cultures, such as indigenous cultures, tend to be intricately linked to the environment in which they exist, and an argument can be made for the implications of forced migration, where countries such as Kiribati or the Maldives that are losing their lands would be forced to assimilate into a new environment, and the implications for the survival of cultures is one concern. Finally, ecosystems. I illustrated the need for mangroves in the previous slide. There are also concerns about coral reef bleaching, which is another coastal protection mechanism that islands rely on that is under threat. And this is a thematic session, of course, that has been covered. Next, I would illustrate Kiribati in a small island state or large ocean state in the Pacific that has purchased lands in 2014, valuing millions of dollars in Fiji. And it's unfortunate that this is what countries have to resort to, considering that even Fiji, of course, faces similar threat. In fact, they are at this moment suffering from Cyclone Yasa. I pulled this headline from a recent Times Magazine article that illustrates the fallout of hurricanes Eta and Iota, which struck countries in Central America, such as Honduras and Nicaragua last month. This mirrored last year's event in Mozambique, where cyclones Idai and Kenneth struck the country in Southern Africa in March and April. So as this headline shows, the leaders are struggling to access the resources they need to help their societies recover from these disaster events. And one more example, countries like Vanuatu have resorted to lawsuits to access that just liability and compensation that they require. So the question is, what is being done? And of course, in 2007, the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC began addressing loss and damage. And 3 years later, in 2010, they established a work program that sought to enhance action and adaptation to strengthen international cooperation and expertise to understand loss and reduce loss and damage with regards to extreme weather events and slow onset events. And I outlined those in the table, illustrating that the extreme events are those seasonal hazards that we typically face. I've spoken about the cyclones, hurricanes that currently threaten. There are still onset events that are the long-term looming threats. However, there's arguments to be made that these are in fact already occurring. For example, an iceberg that broke off of Antarctica 3 years ago is now absolutely threatening the coastal ecosystem of South Georgia in the South Atlantic, according to a recent update from the European Space Agency. So the Water International Mechanism was that mechanism established under the Cancun Adaptation Framework following failed negotiations at previous COPs. And I outlined 3 actions that it proposed, covering risk management, partnerships to take action on areas such as finance. It focused on developing countries and provided mechanisms such as the Green Climate Fund, which focuses on mitigation and adaptation. And I've illustrated that countries are not accessing the resources they need to address the final cost of loss and damage. There was also the Paris Agreement, which celebrated its 5th anniversary last weekend. It was lauded as a climate ambition in mitigation, which of course focuses on keeping global warming to 2, preferably 1.5 degrees through reducing emissions. And in yesterday's opening session, Floyd Newman of the Secretariat illustrated the difference that 0.5 degrees has for loss and damage, which is addressed in Article 8. In that year, though, the Fiji Clearinghouse for Risk Transfer to develop management strategies, which is an information repository, and a task force for displacement was mandated, and the Green Climate Funds expedited support for least developed countries and other developing country parties to formulate national adaptation plans. And so far I've spoken about mitigation, adaptation, which are the two costs that are predominantly focused where climate action is concerned. So this is the gap that has inspired the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. We aim to amplify stories and take action to provoke that just financing that is needed. So far we have written an open letter to the COP26 presidency ahead of COP26, which was held last month. We held a webinar during the London Climate Action Week, which covered stories of loss and damage among youth, and it was attended by Dr. Salima Haq, who's the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, who inspired us to remember our role as youth is to demand action. We are not negotiators, so we absolutely are demanding that the just loss and damage compensation is disseminated. So we invite individuals and organizations who would like to sign our open letter. It's available on our website, and join us in telling stories in any media, being involved in communication strategies such as social media, training in skills such as project management, which has been addressed in this session, and even convening in our strategic planning committee if you have additional ideas. So I finally end with our contact information. So I really invite everyone who would like to take action on this issue to join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Prabha. And that was, I think, a very good note to end. Sorry, it was really quiet up until now, and when I started speaking, they just started working. Right, it was a very good note to, I think, end a series of presentations on. So before we move on to questions, sorry, I'm just going to keep doing this. We have a few more new people here on the call. Just kindly select, this is the group work that will happen after the Q&A. So kindly select which group you want to be, would want to join. You can either rename yourselves with the new name as well as the thematic area, or you could just write it on the chat and our team will assign you to groups. So with that, I think we had a question from Zaya here, but before that, I want to maybe quickly also ask a question that I had, I think more specific for Donna and Linda. And I think for everyone on the call, it's important to also ask questions, keeping into mind that the context of the project proposal has been developed. It might also be very helpful to use this information when moving forward with your work. So for Linda and Donna, just wanted to check in. So you all did mention, especially Donna did mention on community participation really important, and to ensure that the process is both inclusive and participatory. So just wanted to maybe, if you could briefly tell us, because we as a CSO also we do capacity building. So how does, if it's a new project or a new area that we're working in, how does this process start? Because there's also an element of trust that needs to be built with these communities. So perhaps if you could maybe elaborate a bit on, how one goes about this, how the process starts, and what the good entry point is.
Okay, shall I go first? Yeah, okay. Maybe I'll switch my video on. Okay, trust, yes. With our projects, you know, going into communities, particularly those communities that, you know, have their own indigenous knowledge and their own cultural values is really, you know, crucial. You can't just walk in with your science head and say, this is how things need to be done, you know. You got to understand the culture, you got to understand the indigenous knowledge, and you got to work together. So I think gaining trust in that sense, you really need to go on an even keel with the indigenous knowledge and respect that indigenous knowledge. It's extremely important, and then bring in that science level of disaster risk and what we have out there to help local communities adapt and increase their resilience to disasters. So I think, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Donna.
Hi, everyone. I fully resonate with what Linda said. And it's not about us telling communities what to do, but really giving the space for communities to be part of the discourse. And one thing we learned with the Red Cross, because we have a massive network, we are in 192 countries with 160,000 local chapters and the volunteers, it's easier to understand that connect because we stay with communities. So this is an essential factor in a trust building, because it takes years for people to open up. It takes years to understand what are the real risks on the ground. And unless one is fully abreast with the changes and one is fully abreast with the cultural dynamics, it will be very hard to engage community participation. It's a two-way thing. So we need to find ways to ensure we connect, but without being pushy, and also allowing the space for communities to be comfortable with the narrative. And the key message is, do not use the big words in communities. Don't use risks, resilience, Paris Agreement. These do not resonate on the communities, because these translate to them as food on the table, safe shelter, and sustainable livelihoods. And using that narrative and to understand the real essence and real factors of that make them vulnerable, it's a key approach, ensuring that they become part of the process. Thank you.
Donna, and I'm just going to keep you there just to mention, just to maybe pick on something you said, and it's not necessarily related to the topic per se, but you did speak of volunteers, and since this is a youth forum, I think volunteering is something that resonates a lot with youth as well. So maybe a little bit on what the volunteers at IFRC does, and like what would be expected of them, because I think it's a lot of people would want to volunteer, but they're also unsure in which capacity that they can volunteer or where they would be useful. So maybe if you could explain briefly about that, and then we could go on to the other question.
Yeah, sure, we'd be happy to. So volunteers have been a core component of the Red Cross, Red Crescent work. And this is actually our lifeline, because they allow us to be on the ground before, during, and after, and really harness that partnership at the very essence. So traditionally, our volunteers have provided the usual humanitarian response work, the first aid, response operations, etc. But I think the bigger story that is not very popular is that our volunteers are also doing a lot of work in the areas of livelihood, in risk assessment, in water sanitation and health, in the different aspects of humanitarian work, which are all linked to risk reduction, to resilience building, etc. So in on the question, how can they engage? Well, the first step is to approach the local chapter where you are located, and then from there, I think you will be given options on what area you would like to contribute to, and then you become part of the wider volunteer network globally, regionally, and the like. So if if you don't find any local chapter, it would be good to reach out to the national headquarters of Red Cross in your specific country, or feel free to drop a line and I will happily connect you with the people who are managing the volunteer work of the Red Cross. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. That was helpful. And to anyone who also wants to volunteer and who's unsure of where opportunities are, that was just one for you. So we have a question from Zaya to Dennis on what is your view on creating and innovating projects that empower communities to be more self-sufficient, becoming aware of the political fluctuations and understanding that they are able to make change regardless of policies that impact negatively on the environment.
Yes, it's an excellent question. Thank you very much for that. I think that's actually a very important point to keep in mind, that while we advocate for better policies and larger plans and try to connect to global processes, there's a lot that can be done on the local level or on a smaller level that doesn't depend necessarily on those. So there are a lot of actions that communities can do, that projects they can implement that are possible to do without having to be influenced by these larger processes. So I think, yes, I would certainly encourage that. I think it would be wonderful to have communities implement their own projects and empower them to own these projects and keep them running, even after maybe like external project funding has depleted. So for example, for our mangrove conservation and restoration projects, we try to establish community-run nurseries so they can the mangroves can be brought up and planted even long after project funding has run out, and it can be an income source for the community as well, and to establish sustainable livelihoods for the community. And then, of course, a mangrove ecosystem is anyway something that grows over years and decades. So, and that will bring benefits long after maybe like an NGO that does a project has left again. And I think on an international scale, what we see, for example, cities do a lot of like climate commitments and climate action that is decoupled a bit from the national policies or politics. So for example, in America, a lot of cities during the Trump years have like increased climate ambition, even if the overall national policy has not. So yeah, I think that's a very important point, and thank you for that question.
Thank you, Dennis. And yeah, Donna.
Hi, I would like to, I requested for to come in. I think I just want to connect firmly the last topic on loss and damage, and in the wider disaster risk management and climate risk management. I think this is a crucial area, also very high, it's a high priority too in the Red Crescent family, because we are the frontliners, and we are already seeing these losses and damages, this climate impacts on the ground. I think it's important to note that while outside the UNFCCC process, a lot of definitions, a lot of discussions have emanated on what is and what constitutes loss and damage. It is important to note that at the policy level, at the negotiations level, the definition hasn't really been crystallized, and this is where we're struggling at the international level. As however, on the ground, just like what Dennis said, we can do a lot of things to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage if we focus on the risk side of things. I think the key essence in addressing loss and damage is to identify the risks beforehand, so we don't get into a position where we don't have any more options but to accept losses and damages. But if we see it in a risk assessment, in a risk framing, this will allow us to identify what actions we can do to not reach the point where we have no more options. So I think the two fields are nicely connected, and if for those who want to explore more in these areas, the very for us the most effective way to really ensure that communities at risk are moved are away from harm's way and not experience losses and damages. Of course, there are some extremes and slow onset events that are inevitable, but at least find ways to reduce the impact of this risk is to really use the risk management framing and approaches, which was discussed thoroughly by the other speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. And I mean, so earlier Donna did speak of volunteering for the Red Cross Rectors. I'm just going to quickly ask Pavel to maybe share her screen once again. I'm really sorry about that. Share her screen once again, and maybe just your last slide on where you spoke about joining, yes, the Lost Direct Youth, and if you could maybe briefly, like quickly explain once again, because just to let everyone know, because I think this is one thing we also get as an organization, you know, how could I volunteer? Where are the spaces that I could engage in as youth? And I mean, while there is information and knowledge being put out, it's oftentimes lost in all of the discussions. So maybe if you could really say on how people could engage more and what they could do, that would be great.
Thanks. So as I said, we have an open letter on our website that's available for signature by individuals or organizations. It is addressed to the COP26 presidency, and we are convening a strategic planning committee, which happened to be meeting this Sunday. So if you get in contact with us, we are happy to invite anyone who's interested to be a part of the meeting, and we'll be able to offer more information about the coalition then.
Thanks, Pavel. And maybe you could just drop the email address on the chat as well, and maybe they could write you directly. So just to let you know, there are some questions that we have, and there's a question from Kacha. Terms of disaster risk analysis usable to the analysis of management and socio-economic risk. I'm not sure this is who this is addressed to, but if there is anyone who would like to say, one of the panelists who would like to take this question, that would be great.
Okay, let me try. Yes, totally. I think I think it's a very good question. Risk analysis or risk assessment. Normally, it takes into consideration several factors. First, what are information regarding vulnerabilities of communities, and then you also take into consideration the hazard, the science part of what hazard then exacerbates whatever vulnerabilities already have in communities, and then also it identifies the capacities of communities in the same area vis-a-vis the hazard and vis-a-vis the vulnerabilities. So, and then of course the exposure part. So all these four elements are used in any basic risk assessment and risk analysis, whether that's done in a humanitarian sector or done in a development sector. Nor generally the formula is the same, and this definitely apply in socioeconomic risks, because socioeconomic risks also take into consideration the factors that should be addressed to reduce the risks brought about by the socioeconomic policies, by the socioeconomic plans. But so the driver is a bit can vary a bit, but then the whole process of what areas to look for and what areas to focus on is essentially the same. Risk is a very general term, which implies that it essentially tells us that there are factors that contribute to why people are at risk to a specific external event, and then identifying these factors will help us then identify how we can reduce the risk and how we can strengthen capacities. So the formula that then is shared, the description that Linda shared earlier, these are all applicable as well in the context of socioeconomic risks. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. And there is a question from Tinette directed to Dennis. Can you please expand on the context of agriculture insurance in Sri Lanka and its importance in addressing loss and damage due to climate change. What are the gaps in needs and what can be done? And adding to that, I think that's the right question. So that's the short question.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dinetra, for the question. That's an interesting question, but also kind of a long one to answer. So maybe very briefly. So I think insurance is an interesting case of like a mechanism that can be, I guess, the risk management tool, a risk transfer tool specifically. And it basically distributes or shares the risk away from like just the people directly in the path of a hazard to depending on what kind of is, either to financial markets or to the government. So in Sri Lanka, the insurance, the main agricultural insurance, is run by the government, and it's actually not at the moment paid through premiums. So every farmer in Sri Lanka is insured, at least for certain crops and to a certain extent, through the government agricultural insurance. So the risk that the farmer has is shared with basically everyone else who pays taxes in the country. And then, of course, the government itself goes to external reinsurers to reinsure that. So it's also through that shared with the global financial market. And there are other instruments like that, catastrophe bonds or other derivatives that can be used to share risk in, or transfer risk in such a way. Of course, the issue with insurance is also that it's a market-based mechanism. So usually in this case, it's basically run by the government, but it's a big strain on government finances. So there's always a thought of charging premiums for that. And that might be a problem for those who are vulnerable, because they might not have the resources and the capacity to pay these premiums. And also not the, maybe not the financial literacy to really choose the best insurance for them. So I think that would be something that would fall under gaps and needs. Like there's a need for more like financial inclusion and more financial literacy for a better understanding of how risk is composed, how risk management works, and how risk transfer can be part of a risk management strategy. I don't think it works as a mechanism alone. It needs to be part of other measures, such as adaptation measures and risk reduction. But it can address some of the losses and damage that cannot be reduced. And in that way, I think it has the potential to move that risk away from the farmers, or at least from the farmers alone, or from other vulnerable groups, and help address these climate change losses and damages. But again, we need to look very carefully at this, and I don't have time to go into this now, but since it's usually like, if it's not government run, it's run by the private sector, and that means there's also a profit component and a market component embedded into this. So we have this project under the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership that we're implementing in Sri Lanka on crop insurance and the agriculture sector. There will be more knowledge products, and we have some on the Knowledge Hub already. But yes, to your question, it can be can address loss and damage in a certain extent, but it needs to be part of a larger risk management framework, and it needs to we need to be very careful how it works and who is paying for it and who is liable for these risks. I hope that answers at least part of the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Just want to maybe, I'm just going to, there's some new people on the call, and I'm just going to quickly, sorry, I'm just going to keep doing this, but I'm just going to quickly share my screen again once more for the group work. So for these are for everyone who just joined the call. So we do have a component on group work where we'll be further developing the proposals that were selected through the forum. So these are the three groups that we have: oceans like coastal ecosystems, climate change and disaster risk, and sustainable food systems. You could either rename yourself with the group you want to join, or you could just drop it on the chat, saying which group you want to join, and our team will assign you to them. So thank you for that. We also have some questions on the chat. There's a question by Samuel. There's one more question of yours, and I will take Samuel's question first, but Samuel's not online, unfortunately. But so can we discuss disaster risk management in respect to sustainable food systems? I think that will probably have a long answer, but maybe if one or any of the panelists could probably take that and explain that briefly. Or not. Okay, fine. And there's also a question from the director, specifically to Linda. Is APN doing any work in Sri Lanka, especially work relating to agriculture, sustainable food systems? Also, how does the work take into account gender issues?
Hello. I think I answered that question. But yeah, we've had a good few projects in Sri Lanka. A really good one under a climate adaptation framework was on the home garden systems for food security, which was led by Bude Marambe in Paradinea University. I can send some information on that. But we also have others on salinity intrusion and its impacts on cropping systems. Yeah, off the top of my head, that's two I can think of specifically in Sri Lanka.
Thanks, Linda. I'm sorry I missed out on that. It got lost in the chat when I was scrolling through. So also, yes, please.
May I have a small addition? I think on the insurance part in agriculture, what one approach that we are doing globally right now is called forecast-based financing. And this essentially allows us to identify pre-agreed actions with communities, with farmers, with fisher folks, with different groups, pre-agreed actions based on forecasts. And so working with scientists in all these sectors, we sit down and identify, okay, when the forecast says, when it reaches, say, A level, we will do actions 1, 2, 3. When it reaches forecast B level, then we do actions 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, and this becomes a plan that then runs automatically. And when the forecast threshold is hit, financing is then automatically disbursed to allow for the specific actions to be done. So this gives the farmers and the other stakeholders enough time to actually to harvest or move away from harm's way, and then lessen the impact of the typhoon. So this is something that is being tested and implemented in a lot of countries globally. And if you would be interested to, and this nicely complements with, of course, the other approaches in the risk financing continuum. I would like to emphasize what Dennis said, that insurance alone will not solve our problems. Response money alone will not solve our problems, and it cannot stand alone on its own. All of these risk financing mechanisms need to be complemented by each other, and this will allow us to be able to move and to act accordingly based on a specific time scale. Some approaches will wait for the disaster to happen before money is released, and some approaches will be done long before the event happens, which allows us to reduce the risk and minimize the impact. So happy to share a link on the chat box on forecast-based financing for those who are interested to know more about it. Thank you.
That would be great, Donna. Dennis, do you have anything to add, or there's one more question that we can take?
No, I wanted to add, but already Donna has said it, what I wanted to add. So I think I'm good. I just wanted to add, that's definitely like very important to keep in mind, very interesting that there is different time scales, also different things. So it's good to move to this to advanced financing and forecast-based financing. And then we can also have different insurance solutions itself, for example, index-based insurance to cover like direct needs because it can be paid out much quicker, and then indemnity-based insurance to have a more detailed assessment of damages, and then have a longer, like after a few months, for example, recovery and reconstruction finance. Yeah, thank you.
All right, I think we answered all of the questions on the chat. If anyone has any other burning questions You could either type it or just unmute yourselves. Everyone's allowed to do so and ask any of the panelists your questions. And Dawn has also dropped in some links on the chat. Thank you very much. It looks like there are no burning questions. I would like to maybe invite all panelists to probably just give us like a 30-second to 60-second closing remark on a small like closing remarks on what's been discussed, and that might also potentially help the remarks carry forward to the group work. That might be helpful for them. So we could probably go in the order in which the speakers spoke at first. So maybe Donna, Dennis, Linda, and Cavell.
It's always hard to start the ball rolling, but thank you. I think my message is going to be anchored on two things. Disaster risk management and climate risk management is something that allows us to manage risks at different time scales to ensure that communities most at risk are actually resilient and their vulnerabilities are actually reduced. Let us use this these key messages in developing plans and programs and projects. At the end of the day, it needs to be centered and anchored on what communities need, what communities need today and tomorrow, and what they can contribute in the discourse. Resilience building, adaptation, risk reduction, these are big words coming at different levels. At the end of the day, it matters most on the ground and making sure that we reach the last mile first in all our interventions. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. Dennis?
Yes, I agree with everything Donna said. And I mean, if it's a takeaway, I would say we have to deal with climate risk. There's no way around it. Regardless of what we're doing, what kind of project, what kind of activity, we'll face some kind of climate risk. And we need to be proactive about it and manage it. As Donna has said, risks of today and the risk of the future. So we cannot predict the future, but we can. We have forecasts, we have projections, we have a good idea of what's going to happen and what scenarios there are, and we need to take them into account with whatever we are doing, and also to address them through projects directly. And so, yeah, for planning any project, any activity, I think risk management and especially climate risk management is something we need to take into account on all levels. And I would also agree that this last mile is very important to have the activities on the ground, but connect them to the global and national and regional processes, and to not work in a silo, but to work on a scale that you can work on, and upscale it if possible, but better to do a smaller project than to do nothing. And it's always possible to scale it up later. So yeah, keep climate risk in mind and find a way to address it. Otherwise, the consequences will be coming, because there is climate risk and there's no way around it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Linda?
Let me start. I'm still here. I'm just trying to.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry about that. My video is on, yeah?
It's not on for me.
Oh, okay. Let me just switch my video on. I've got so many things open on my computer. Yeah. A takeaway message. It's kind of difficult to give a takeaway message for this particular session, but you know, APN has a plethora of activities on disaster management, and linking climate adaptation with loss and damage and disaster risk reduction is something that APN has been doing for a while. In fact, we, under our climate adaptation framework, we did a lot of work. I think we covered about 14 projects. I think what I'd like to say, really, as we're a network, particularly focusing on capacity development, I'd like to really encourage those early career scientists and youth to engage with APN, particularly under our capacity development program. I mean, there are so many opportunities, especially for project planning. And maybe as a final remark, just to follow on what Dennis said, silos are old school. Your work really needs to be holistic, and it really needs to cross all sectors engaged in disaster risk reduction. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for entertaining me. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Corbell.
Thank you. I would just like to underscore the point that, as Donna said, the Paris Agreement does address loss and damage under Article 8, where it seeks to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And as Anna said, those slow onset events that are looming future threats are currently being observed. And so we need ambition, not just in the mitigation and adaptation, but in addressing the current loss and damage that nations are being seen and that developing countries are particularly vulnerable to and unfortunately don't have the capacity to deal with themselves.
All right. Thanks, Corbell, and thank you to everyone who joined. And just to let everyone know, we are going to break out into groups now, and our Facebook live stream will stop. So thank you to everyone who joined us on Facebook. I've dropped the Zoom link on Facebook if anyone wants to join in on the group work. So thank you to everyone who joins Facebook, and see you at our next session, which is in about an hour's time. So thank you very much. And if you can give me maybe a minute, I will send all of you all into groups. And until that, I will also share my screen for those who still haven't chosen join a group. These are the groups. But if not, I'll be just putting everyone else into the other group. 1 minute.